The air in the museum's grand atrium was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and money. It was a strange mixture, like flowers trying to bloom in a vault. High above, a glass ceiling revealed the dark, starless sky of the city, a canvas blotted out by the glow of a million lights. Down below, people moved in clusters, their laughter like the tinkling of delicate glass. They were dressed in silks and wools that probably cost more than everything she owned. And in the middle of it all sat Clara at a gleaming black grand piano that felt more like a museum piece than an instrument. Her fingers danced over the ivory keys, coaxing out a gentle melody by a long-dead composer. It was pretty, safe, and utterly forgettable. It was background noise, a soundtrack for the rich to ignore while they talked about their stocks and their summer homes. She was used to it. Being invisible was a skill she had perfected over years of playing in hotel lobbies and at events just like this one. Her job was to be heard but not listened to fill the silence without ever disturbing it. She thought about her small apartment on the other side of town, with its squeaky floorboard and the view of a brick wall. She thought about the pile of bills on her kitchen table and the faces of the young students she taught, their eyes lighting up when they finally mastered a simple scale. This gig paid for those things. It paid for the music that actually mattered. So she played on, her expression placid, her mind a million miles away, lost in the rhythm of the notes and the quiet hum of her own thoughts. Then the energy in the room shifted. It was a subtle thing, like a change in the wind before a storm. The chatter seemed to quiet down just a little. People's postures straightened. Heads turned. A man was moving through the crowd, and the crowd was parting for him like the sea. He wasn't particularly tall or muscular, but he moved with an air of absolute confidence, as if the world was a carpet rolled out just for him. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that seemed to absorb the light, and his hair was cut in a sharp, severe style that spoke of expensive taste and no-nonsense efficiency. This was Julian Croft, the man whose name was on the building, the foundation, and the invitation. He was a tech genius, a billionaire, a man who had reshaped the world with lines of code and ruthless business deals. He was also known for his sharp tongue and his belief that everything, from a piece of software to a piece of art, could be measured, quantified, and ultimately bought. He stopped near the piano, his entourage of sharp-suited men and elegant women fanning out behind him like a royal court. He listened for a moment, his head cocked to one side, a look of mild boredom on his face. Clara felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She knew who he was, of course. Everyone did. And she knew his reputation. She tried to focus on the music, to lose herself in the notes, but she could feel his eyes on her. It was like being under a spotlight. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, listening, his expression unchanging. Clara's fingers began to feel stiff and clumsy. The music, which had flowed so easily a moment ago, now felt forced and brittle. She could feel a thin layer of sweat forming on her upper lip. She was nearing the end of the piece, and she rushed the final few notes, a tiny, almost imperceptible mistake that only she would have noticed. But she felt sure he had noticed too. As the last chord faded into the cavernous room, a smattering of polite applause rose from the nearby guests. Clara let out a slow, silent breath and placed her hands in her lap, her job done for the next few minutes. But Julian Croft didn't move. He took a step closer to the piano, the polished heels of his shoes clicking sharply on the marble floor. The small crowd around them fell silent, sensing a confrontation. "That was pleasant," he said, his voice smooth and clear, carrying easily across the space. The word pleasant was a dart designed to sound like a compliment but landing like an insult. Clara looked up at him, forcing a small, professional smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He leaned against the side of the piano, his gaze sweeping over her, then over the indifferent crowd. "It's technically proficient, of course," he continued, his tone casual, as if he were discussing the weather. "But it's soulless. It's the auditory equivalent of a stock photo. You see it, you register it, and you forget it a second later." A few people in the crowd chuckled nervously. Clara felt her face flush with heat. Her hands, which had been resting calmly in her lap, clenched into fists. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, to defend the music, but her throat felt tight. She was just a hired hand, a background musician. What could she possibly say to a man like this? He seemed to enjoy her silence, his smirk widening. "You see, I believe true genius is the rarest commodity on earth," he said, raising his voice so that more people could hear. "It can't be taught, it can't be bought, and it certainly can't be replicated. It's a lightning strike. And I'm afraid," he said, gesturing vaguely at the piano, "we're not witnessing a lightning strike here. We're witnessing a very expensive, very well-maintained light bulb." The chuckles in the crowd grew a little louder. Clara felt a wave of humiliation wash over her. She felt small and exposed, as if he had stripped away her uniform of professionalism and left her standing there, in her worn-out shoes and her second-hand dress. Then he did something that made her blood run cold. He turned to face the entire room, his arms spread wide in a theatrical gesture. "But I am a man who likes to be proven wrong," he announced. "In fact, I enjoy it. It reminds me that the world still has surprises." His eyes found hers again, and they were glinting with a challenging, almost predatory light. "So, I have a proposition. A challenge, if you will." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the anticipation build. "I will write a check for $1 million to this charity. Right now, tonight." A murmur of excitement rippled through the crowd. $1 million. It was an absurd, obscene amount of money. "All you have to do," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper as he leaned back towards her, "is play one piece of music. One single piece that is genuinely, undeniably shocking and original. Something that makes me feel something I've never felt before. Something that proves me wrong about you, about this pleasant little performance." The room was utterly silent now. Everyone was watching her, waiting. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. He straightened up, a triumphant look on his face. He had her cornered, and he knew it. "But," he added, his voice hardening, "there's a catch. Because a challenge needs stakes. If you play and I deem it a failure, which I almost certainly will, you will stand up, thank everyone for coming, and publicly admit that I was right. You'll admit that your music is, as I said, soulless. And you will forfeit your payment for the evening." The gasp from the crowd was audible. It was a cruel, humiliating stipulation. It was designed to break her. He wasn't just challenging her skill. He was attacking her dignity. He was making a spectacle of her for his own entertainment. She looked at his smug, confident face, at the sea of curious onlookers, and for a moment she felt a powerful urge to just run. To get up, push past him, and flee from the room, from the judgment, from the suffocating weight of his challenge. But where could she go? Her feet felt glued to the floor. The piano pedals felt cold and hard under her shoes. She thought of her students again, of their bright, hopeful faces. She thought of the music she loved, the music that was her true voice, the music she kept hidden away like a precious secret. He was calling that music a lie. He was calling her a fraud. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. The fear was still there, a cold not in her stomach, but a new feeling was rising up to meet it. A spark of anger. A flicker of defiance. She took a deep, shaky breath and looked him straight in the eye. "Okay," she said, her voice clear and steady, surprising even herself. "I accept." The word "okay" hung in the air, small and fragile, yet it seemed to silence the entire room. It was a pebble dropped into a still pond, and the ripples of quiet spread outwards, touching everyone. For a moment no one moved. The man in the expensive suit, Julian, looked slightly taken aback, as if he had expected her to crumble, to cry, or to run away. He had not expected this quiet, steady acceptance. A flicker of something new interest perhaps crossed his face before being replaced by his usual look of confident amusement. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, then stepped back, folding his arms across his chest. He leaned against a tall marble pillar, settling in. The predator had found his comfortable spot to watch the show. Clara felt the weight of his gaze, but it was joined by hundreds of others. It was a physical pressure, like being at the bottom of a deep swimming pool. The air grew thick and heavy. She could feel the collective breath of the crowd, all held in anticipation. Her hands, which had been clenched into fists in her lap, felt stiff and cold. She slowly unfolded them and placed them back on the keys. The ivory was cool and smooth under her trembling fingers. It felt alien, like the surface of a planet she had never visited. This piano was a perfect, pristine machine, built in a factory by experts, designed to produce pure, beautiful sounds. It had never known the dust of a cramped apartment or the vibrations of a passing train. It was everything she was not. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic, wild drumbeat in the sudden oppressive silence. A bead of sweat trickled down her temple, and she resisted the urge to wipe it away. Any movement now would seem like a sign of weakness. She could hear the whispers starting up again, like the rustling of dry leaves. They weren't loud, but in the silence they were sharp and clear. Each one felt like a tiny needle pricking at her skin. Who does she think she is? She's going to be humiliated. Did you see his face? He's enjoying this. She knew they weren't being cruel, not really. They were just spectators at a show they never expected to see. But their words, imagined or real, only added to the weight on her shoulders. Her mind raced, a frantic bird throwing itself against the walls of her skull. What could she possibly play? The first thought that surfaced was a flash of pure panic, a desperate desire to show them all. She could play the Liszt, the Hungarian Rhapsody, No. 2. It was a piece of incredible technical difficulty, full of fire and passion and cascading notes that could make an audience leap to its feet. It was a showstopper, a crowd pleaser. Her fingers knew it well, but the thought died as quickly as it came. She pictured Julian's face as she played it. He would listen with a critical ear, his head tilted. He would note the missed note, the slightly imperfect trill. He would applaud politely at the end and say, "Very impressive." A wonderful imitation. But still just an imitation. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that technical skill would not save her. This man had the world's greatest virtuosos fly to his private concerts to play for him. He was not impressed by fast fingers. He was looking for something else, something he claimed didn't exist. What else, then? A piece of such profound, heartbreaking sadness that it would make the whole room weep? A Chopin nocturne, perhaps? She could pour all her own fear and humiliation into it, make the melody weep for her. But again she dismissed it. He would see it as a cheap trick, an emotional manipulation. He would call it melodramatic. A jaunty jazz piece, then? Something to show she was fun and spontaneous? No, he would see it as fluff, as meaningless noise. Every idea that came to her felt like a trap. Every piece of music she had ever learned felt like a costume she could put on, and he was the kind of man who would look right past the costume and see the frightened person hiding underneath. She was trapped. The challenge was not to play a piece of music. The challenge was to play something that was not music at all, something that was true, and then she did the only thing she could do. She closed her eyes. It was a simple act, but it felt like a revolution. The moment her eyelids fluttered shut, the world changed. The oppressive room, with its marble pillars and judgmental faces, faded away. The pressure on her skin lessened. The whispers in the air dissolved into nothing. All that was left was the darkness behind her eyes and the feel of the cool keys beneath her fingers. She was no longer in a museum surrounded by wealth. She was just a girl at a piano. And in the quiet darkness, a memory began to bloom, not as a picture, but as a feeling. She was a little girl again, sitting on the worn linoleum floor of her family's small apartment. The sun was streaming through the single grimy window, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny fairies. The apartment was always filled with sounds. It was never quiet. It was the first music she ever knew. There was the deep, rumbling groan of the subway train passing beneath the building. It wasn't a scary sound. It was a comforting vibration that she felt in her bones, a constant reminder that the city was alive and breathing all around her. Then there was the high, lonely wail of a siren in the distance, a cry that told a story of someone else's emergency, someone else's bad day, a sound that made her feel safe in her own small room. She remembered the sounds from the street below. the angry shout of a neighbor who had locked himself out of his car, the sharp, barking laugh of a woman telling a joke on her phone, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of a basketball being dribbled against the pavement, and through it all, the gentle, constant cooing of the pigeons that nested on the windowsill, their soft sounds a peaceful counterpoint to the chaos of the city. These were the notes of her childhood. This was the symphony that had played in the background of her life. She didn't have a fancy piano back then. Her first instrument was the world itself. She learned to listen, to pick out the individual melodies in the cacophony, to find the rhythm in the randomness. She remembered how she would try to replicate those sounds on the old, out-of-tune upright piano her grandmother had given her. She would press down on the low bass pedals to make the floor vibrate like the subway. She would pluck at the strings inside the piano to mimic the metallic screech of the fire escape. She would play two high, dissonant keys at the same time to capture the sound of the pigeons arguing. It wasn't music, not in the way her teacher understood it. It was just sound. It was a way of holding on to the world, of capturing the feeling of being alive, right there in that small, dusty apartment. And suddenly she knew. She knew what she had to do. The most shocking thing she could play for these people, for this man who thought everything could be bought and sold, was not a song written by a dead genius. It wasn't a display of technical perfection. The most shocking thing she could play was the truth. It was a memory. It was the sound of her own world. It was the music that had no price tag, the music that couldn't be quantified or replicated, because it came from a place that no amount of money could ever buy. A slow, calm certainty settled over her. The frantic bird in her mind stopped its struggling and settled quietly. The fear was still there, a low hum in the background, but it no longer had power over her. She took one last, deep breath, filling her lungs with the air of the museum, the air of her world. And then she began to play. She took one last, deep breath, filling her lungs with the air of the museum, the air of her world. And then she began to play. But it wasn't music. Not in the way anyone in that room understood it. Her left hand, which had been resting so calmly, pressed down on a low, deep bass note. A single, resonant hum filled the space, a sound so fundamental it felt like it was coming from the floor itself. She held the note, letting it vibrate, and then she gently pressed her foot on the sustain pedal, letting the sound bloom and hang in the air like a heavy fog. It was the sound of the subway, the deep, guttural groan of the train passing beneath her childhood apartment. A confused murmur went through the crowd. People shifted in their seats, exchanging puzzled glances. This wasn't a melody. It was just a noise. A long, drawn-out, slightly uncomfortable noise. Julian, leaning against his pillar, raised an eyebrow. A faint, superior smile played on his lips. This was her big idea. A sound effect? Clara's right hand joined in, but it didn't play a chord. Instead, her fingers moved with a strange, delicate purpose. She reached down inside the piano, her hand disappearing into the body of the instrument. The guests craned their necks, trying to see what she was doing. Then came a new sound. A sharp, metallic screech like a rusty hinge being forced open. She had plucked one of the thick bass strings directly. It was a jarring, ugly sound that made a few people flinch. She did it again, a different string, creating a dissonant, metallic clang. This was the sound of the old fire escape outside her window, the sound she would hear every time her neighbor came home late. The room was growing restless now. The whispers were louder, more insistent. What is she doing? Is this a joke? This is just noise. Julian's smile had tightened. He was no longer amused. He was trying to figure it out, to categorize it, to put it in a box. But it wouldn't fit. It wasn't jazz. It wasn't classical. It wasn't avant-garde performance art. It was just sound. She continued to build her world. With her right hand back on the keys, she began to play a series of high, staccato notes, short and sharp, like little pecks. They were random, atonal, and chaotic. It was the sound of the sparrows on the windowsill, fighting over a crust of bread. Then she played two notes together, a dissonant, ugly interval that hung in the air like a question mark. The cooing of the pigeons, their gentle sound turned into something mournful and strange. She was a conductor, and her orchestra was made of memories. The low rumble of the subway was the bass line. The metallic screech of the fire escape was the percussion. The chaotic chirping of the birds was the melody. It was a symphony of a city street, a portrait of a life that was messy, noisy, and imperfect. The audience was now visibly uncomfortable. Some were looking at their watches. Others were whispering openly to their neighbors. A few had even started to get up, as if preparing to leave. They had come for pleasant background music, and they were getting something raw and unsettling. They felt tricked, but Julian hadn't moved. He was standing up straight now, his arms no longer crossed. His face was a mask of intense concentration, his brow furrowed in a deep frown. He was no longer the bored billionaire judging a contest. He was a man trying to solve a puzzle that was buried deep inside his own mind. The sounds were getting to him. The rumble of the bass note was vibrating through the marble floor, up through the solace of his expensive shoes and into his bones. It was a familiar feeling, a feeling he hadn't experienced in decades. The sharp, metallic clang of the plucked string made him flinch, a visceral reaction he couldn't control. It was the sound of a gate closing, the sound of his childhood home. He was trying to fight it, to analyze it with the logical, data-driven part of his brain, but the sounds were bypassing his intellect completely. They were speaking a different language, an older language, the language of feeling. And then, just as the cacophony reached its peak, just as the room felt like it might tip over into outright confusion, something incredible happened. From the middle of the chaos, a new sound emerged. It was a single, pure, clear note played by her right hand. It was simple, almost childlike in its innocence. And then another note, and another, forming a simple, hesitant melody. It was a tune she remembered humming to herself as a little girl, a tune she had made up to pass the time. It wasn't complicated or clever. It was just true. This melody didn't fight the noise. It didn't try to conquer it. Instead, it wove its way through the chaos. It floated over the deep rumble of the subway. It danced around the metallic screech of the fire escape. It found its place in the spaces between the chaotic chirping of the birds. It was the sound of hope and beauty found in a harsh, overlooked world. It was the sound of a human spirit, refusing to be drowned out by the noise. The effect on the room was instantaneous and profound. The restless shifting stopped. The whispers died away. The people who had been about to leave sank back into their seats. They were no longer confused or uncomfortable. They were mesmerized. They were starting to understand. This wasn't just a collection of noises. This was a story. It was a story about a life, a world, a feeling that they all recognized, even if they had never heard it expressed this way before. An old woman in the front row dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, a faraway look in her eyes. She was remembering her own small apartment, her own noisy street, her own forgotten melodies. A tough-looking man in a tight suit, who had been smirking just moments before, now had a look of raw vulnerability on his face. His jaw was clenched, but a single glistening tear traced a path down his cheek. The music was unlocking something inside them. Something they had kept buried for years. The most dramatic change was in Julian. He stood frozen, his face pale and exposed. The confident mask of the billionaire had completely shattered, replaced by the raw, unguarded face of a little boy. The sounds of the city she had created were no longer just sounds. They were memories. The rumble of the subway was the sound of his father leaving for the factory at dawn. The screech of the fire escape was the sound of him sneaking out after curfew. The lonely wail of a distant siren, which she had mimicked with a high, trembling note, was the sound of the night his world had fallen apart. And through it all, that simple, pure melody was the sound of his mother's voice, humming a lullaby as she tried to soothe his fears. He was no longer in a museum, surrounded by strangers. He was back in his old neighborhood, a place he had spent his entire life and fortune trying to forget. He felt exposed, stripped bare, and utterly, deeply shaken. He had challenged her to create something original, and she had created a universe of feeling from the raw materials of everyday life. She hadn't just played a piece of music. She had played his soul. The piece reached its final emotional crescendo. The melody and the soundscape swirled together, not in a neat, tidy resolution, but in a complex, messy, and beautiful harmony. It was the sound of life itself, with all its chaos and its beauty, its pain and its hope. And then, as slowly as it had begun, it started to fade. She let the final, pure note hang in the air, her foot still on the sustain pedal, allowing the sound to decay slowly, echoing into the silence until it was gone. And in its wake it left a silence so profound it was deafening. No one clapped. No one spoke. No one moved. They just sat there, in the sacred space she had created, their hearts pounding, their minds reeling, their souls laid bare. The silence was not an absence of sound. It was a presence. It was filled with the ghosts of the notes they had just heard, with the echoes of their own forgotten memories. It was the most shocking and original thing any of them had ever experienced. The final, pure note faded into the air, but it didn't disappear. It seemed to soak into the marble walls, the velvet curtains, and the very souls of the people sitting in the gilded chairs. The silence that followed was not an empty silence. It was a heavy, full silence, vibrating with the ghosts of the sounds they had just heard. It was the kind of silence that comes after a great storm, when the world seems to be holding its breath, taking stock of what has been lost and what remains. No one clapped. No one spoke. To make a sound now would feel like a violation, like shouting in a sacred place. People sat frozen, some with their heads bowed, others staring at the piano with wide, unseeing eyes. An old man in the front row slowly removed his glasses and polished them with a handkerchief, though his hands were shaking too much to do a proper job. A woman, who had been meticulously composed all evening, had a streak of black mascara running down her cheek like a river of ink. The music had not just been heard. It had been experienced. It had bypassed their ears and gone straight into their chests, rattling the cages of their own forgotten memories. The man who had issued the challenge, Julian, was the most still of all. He stood by his pillar, no longer leaning against it. His posture was rigid, as if he had been turned to stone. The mask of the bored, cynical billionaire was gone. In its place was a raw, exposed landscape of pain and wonder. His face, usually a carefully constructed fortress of control, was now an open book. His mouth was slightly agape, his eyes wide and glistening. The polished, confident man who had walked into the room an hour ago was gone, replaced by a lost little boy from a forgotten town. The sounds she had made were not just sounds to him. They were keys. Keys that had unlocked doors in his mind that he had bolted shut decades ago, the deep, rumbling bass note. That was not a subway. That was the sound of the furnace in the basement of his childhood home, a groaning, hungry beast that he and his mother would feed with coal every winter morning. He could feel the cold linoleum on his bare feet again, could smell the sharp, clean scent of the coal dust, the metallic screech of the plucked string. That was not a fire escape. That was the sound of the heavy iron gate at the entrance to the steel mill where his father worked. He remembered the sound of it slamming shut every day, a sound that meant his father was gone for another 12 hours, swallowed by the heat and the noise. He remembered waiting for that gate to screech open again in the evening, waiting to see his father's tired, soot-covered face emerge from the gloom and the simple, hesitant melody that had woven its way through the chaos. That was the most devastating of all. It was his mother's song. It wasn't a famous lullaby. It was a simple tune she had made up herself, a little melody she would hum when she was cooking or mending his clothes. It was a sound of love, a sound of safety, a sound that meant everything was going to be okay. He hadn't heard that melody or even thought of it in over 40 years. He had built a life dedicated to forgetting that tune, to forgetting the cold floors and the steel mill gate and the smell of coal dust. He had surrounded himself with the most expensive, the most beautiful, the most perfect things the world could offer, all to silence the sounds of his past. And in 5 minutes, this woman, this stranger, had brought it all flooding back. She had not played music. She had played his life. The spell was finally broken by a sound. It wasn't a clap. It was a sob, a quiet, choked sound from a woman in the third row. It was a sound of pure, unvarnished emotion, and it gave everyone else permission to breathe again. A man near her stood up, not to leave, but as if in respect. Then another person stood up. And another. Soon, the entire room was on its feet. But it still wasn't a normal standing ovation. There was no cheering, no whistling. It was a silent, rising tide of people. Then the applause began. It started slowly, a few scattered claps that sounded like raindrops on a tin roof. But it grew quickly, swelling into a thunderous, overwhelming roar. It was not polite applause. It was desperate, emotional, almost frantic. People were clapping as if their lives depended on it, as if they could somehow give back a piece of what they had just received. They were clapping for her, but they were also clapping for the forgotten parts of themselves that her music had awakened through the wall of sound. Clara sat frozen at the piano. She felt disconnected, as if she were watching the scene from a great distance. Her hands were trembling in her lap. She felt drained, empty, like a vessel that had been poured out completely. She had not planned to play that. She had not even known it was inside her. It had just flowed out of her, a raw, unfiltered torrent of memory and feeling. Now, looking at the sea of faces, all turned towards her with expressions of awe and gratitude, she felt a wave of shyness, of vulnerability. She had not meant to bare her soul so completely. She had only meant to answer a challenge. She gave a small, awkward nod, a quick, almost invisible bow of her head, and then she stood up. All she wanted to do was escape. To gather her sheet music and disappear into the night. To be alone with the echoes of what she had just done. As she began to pack her worn folder of music, a path began to open in the crowd. People were stepping aside, making way for someone. She looked up and saw him coming towards her. It was Julian. He was walking slowly, deliberately, as if moving through a dream. The crowd parted for him, but they were not looking at him with the usual reverence or fear. They were looking at him with a new kind of curiosity, a shared understanding of what he had just been through. He stopped a few feet away from her. He was not the same man. The arrogance had been stripped away, leaving behind something raw and uncertain. He looked at her not as a challenge to be won, but as a person. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, as if the words were too heavy to form. For the first time in his adult life, Julian Croft, the man who always had the answer, the man who could buy anything, was utterly and completely speechless. He just stood there, his eyes locked on hers, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The challenge was over. She had won. But looking at his face, she didn't see a defeated man. She saw a man who had been found. The silence that followed the thunderous applause was somehow even more profound than the one that had followed her music. The room was a sea of raw, open emotions. People were not just looking at her. They were looking through her into their own pasts. She felt like a ghost who had accidentally wandered into a room full of people remembering their dreams. All she wanted was to disappear, to fold herself up and slip away before someone tried to pin a medal on her or ask her questions she couldn't answer. She quickly stuffed her dog-eared sheet music into its worn folder, her hands still trembling slightly. The familiar feel of the frayed cardboard was a small anchor in the storm. Then she saw him coming. The crowd parted for him, but it was different now. It wasn't the parting of the sea for a powerful king. It was the quiet, respectful way people make way for someone who is grieving or someone who has just witnessed a miracle. He walked slowly, his expensive shoes seeming to find no purchase on the gleaming marble floor. He stopped a few feet from her, a man adrift in the wreckage of his own confidence. He looked smaller, less sharp. The perfectly tailored suit seemed to hang on him a little loosely. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his jaw working silently. For a long moment he just looked at her, his eyes filled with a confusion so deep it was almost like pain. He was searching for the words, but she understood. There were no words for what had just happened. Finally he spoke, his voice a rough, quiet whisper, a complete contrast to the booming, confident tone he had used earlier. I don't know what to say, he began, and a small, humorless laugh escaped his lips. Imagine that, me, without a speech. He shook his head slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor for a second before meeting her eyes again. I was wrong. I was so wrong. About everything. He wasn't looking at her as a performer he had judged. He was looking at her as a fellow human being who had just held up a mirror and shown him a truth he had spent a lifetime running from. That sound... The rumble? That was my father's furnace. And the gate, the sound of the mill. He trailed off, his voice thick with an emotion he was clearly unaccustomed to showing. You didn't just play music, you remembered for me. Things I had locked away and thrown away the key. Clara stood there, her folder clutched to her chest like a shield. She had expected anger or resentment or at best a gracious but distant admission of defeat. She had not expected this. This raw, unfiltered vulnerability. She saw the little boy he used to be standing in front of her, and she felt a strange sense of pity, mixed with a quiet sense of victory that had nothing to do with the challenge. I'm sorry, she said, her voice soft. I didn't mean to. He shook his head, cutting her off gently. Don't you dare apologize, he said, a hint of his old firmness returning, but it was tempered with a new warmth. You did exactly what I asked? You shocked me. You gave me something I've never felt before. You humbled me. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a checkbook and a fancy pen. He balanced the checkbook on the polished lid of the grand piano, his hand surprisingly unsteady as he wrote. He didn't just scribble a number. He wrote it out carefully as if the act itself was a ceremony. $1 million. He tore the check from the book and held it out to her. It was a small piece of paper, but it felt like it had the weight of the entire world on it. Clara looked at the check, then back at his face. She didn't reach for it. Taking the money felt wrong somehow. It would cheapen what had just happened. It would turn her moment of pure, honest expression into a transaction. It would mean he had bought her memory, and she wasn't for sale. I can't, she said quietly, shaking her head. That's not why I played. He looked at the check in his hand, then back at her, and a slow understanding dawned on his face. He nodded, a flicker of the old, sharp intelligence returning to his eyes. You're right, he said. You're absolutely right. It's not about the money. It never was. He folded the check and put it back in his pocket. The money is still going to the charity, of course. A deal is a deal, but that's not the important part. The important part is what happens now. He took another step closer, his expression earnest, almost pleading. You showed me tonight that the most valuable things, the most beautiful things, come from places we ignore. From the noise, the chaos, the real world. I've spent my life building a perfect, quiet, sterile world for myself. I've been collecting art, but I haven't been feeling it. I've been listening to music, but I haven't been hearing it. You changed that. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I want to do something. Something that matters. I want to build a place. A music school. Not a fancy conservatory for prodigies. A real place in a neighborhood where kids have nothing. A place with old pianos and maybe a few guitars. A place where they can come after school and make noise. A place where they can learn to find the music in their own world, just like you did. Clara stared at him, her heart starting to beat a little faster. She saw it then. This wasn't a bribe. This wasn't a way to ease his conscience. This was his way of answering the music. He wasn't just trying to make up for his cruelty. He was trying to build something beautiful out of the rubble of his old worldview. I don't understand, she said softly. What does this have to do with me? Everything, he said, his voice filled with a passion she hadn't seen before. I can fund it. I can buy the building and the instruments. But I can't give it a soul? I don't know how? You do. You're the only one who does. He took a deep breath. I don't want you to be a performer at its opening. I want you to be its heart. I want you to be its artistic director. I want you to teach those kids how to listen, how to find the subway in the bass notes and the pigeons in the high keys. I want you to teach them that their stories, their noises, their lives are worth hearing. The offer hung in the air between them, more valuable than any check. It was a chance to take the secret music she had kept hidden for so long and share it, to give it a purpose beyond her own survival. It was a chance to give other kids the gift she had given herself, the ability to find beauty in a broken world. She thought of her own small apartment, of her students with their bright, hopeful eyes. She thought of the music that lived inside her, the music that had finally been set free. A slow smile spread across her face, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She looked at the man in front of her, no longer seeing a cruel billionaire, but a person who had been lost and was now, finally, finding his way home. "Okay," she said, her voice clear and steady, just like it had been when she accepted the challenge. "Okay, I'll do it." And in that moment, in the quiet, transformed room, a new song began. A song not of a challenge, but of a partnership. A song not of humiliation, but of hope. A song that, just like hers, was built from the simple, powerful, and shocking sounds of real life.